Today we're discussing some updated NHL trade rumors, including talk on the Minnesota Wild, New York Rangers, and the Buffalo Sabres. We'll get into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back here to Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, I have some updated NHL trade rumors I'd like to discuss with you here today to get your thoughts on what other moves we might see during this NHL offseason. Now, first of all, I want to get started with the Minnesota Wild. Reading recent reports from Michael Russo of The Athletic indicate that Paul Fenton, the GM of the Wild, has actually been quietly shopping forward Zach Parise to try to determine if there is a trade market that could possibly open up for him to move the veteran forward. Now, of course, Parise recently turned 35, still has a lot of term left on his contract. As we know, Parise is a player who's battled a lot of injuries and has had a really hard time staying healthy, completing a full year, and being as productive as he knows that he's capable of, and what he'd like to be able to contribute to his team here over the last number of years. Now, Zach Parise still has 6 years left at $7.5 million. So, as we discussed a few days ago, some of the most difficult contracts around the NHL to move, this one certainly qualifies in that category and certainly would not be easy for the Wild to pull off if a trade were to be found. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is because of the contract and the nature of how this was done, this type of contract is no longer legal in the NHL. So if he retires before the end of his contract, there would be a recapture penalty like we saw recently here with the Roberto Luongo retirement. So in that case, the team who signed the contract originally, as well as the team currently holding the contract, so in that case, the Canucks and the Panthers, both have a salary cap penalty since Luongo did not fulfill the full terms of the contract. So the same thing could happen here if Parise were to retire before the 6 years are up. So obviously an acquiring team needs to keep that in mind. Of course, given his health and the term left on the contract is another factor. And I assume the Minnesota Wild would more than likely have to retain a fair bit of salary to make this remotely feasible. If a team could acquire Zach Parise with a $4 to $5 million cap hit, though, it's certainly a possibility that's something they might entertain. I mean, he's been around the NHL a long time. He is certainly a very capable offensive player. If he could get his health together and remain healthy, he very well could end up being a very key contributor to a team's long-term success. Now, Michael Russo also recently completed an interview with Parise to get his thoughts on playing hockey in Minnesota, how things have gone, and kind of where things are at in his career. Now, here's a quote here from Parise from this interview after being asked about the possibility of being traded. He says, "I think I want to win. I want to win here, and I do love everything away from the rink. We've got so many friends through the kids away from the rink, away from hockey. It's so great. It's so great. That's the hard part. But you get to that point where you want to win. That's all you want to do. Trust me, we'd all love to win here. I think this place would be absolute insanity if we won here. So that's the goal. I mean, I just don't know. Let's put it this way. They haven't come asking me if I want to get traded somewhere. We love everything about Minnesota. It's just the hockey part lately has been difficult." So obviously for Zach Parise, the hockey part has been difficult for a variety of reasons, but obviously because of his age and the fact that time is ticking away, he does ultimately want to win that Stanley Cup. So could the Minnesota Wild possibly go to Zach Parise and ask him to waive his no trade clause? Because that's another part of this that complicates things as well. We know GM Paul Fenton's not going to do that unless he has a deal that's ready to be made here that he feels would benefit his team and that Zach Parise would strongly consider for an opportunity to win the Stanley Cup. Obviously, moving a player like Parise could very well prove to be a great move for the Wild. At the same time, he has been a very key part of this team when he can stay healthy. But it could also help them free up a lot of cap space and help get this team moving in a younger direction. So as much as the team has been quietly making considerations to possibly make this move, and I do think to some degree Zach Parise would be open to it, ultimately he wants to win in Minnesota. He has a no trade clause which complicates things, and he still has a lot of term and a lot of money left on a deal for a player who has a hard time staying healthy. So I do think it's a remotely slim possibility, like I said, especially if they're willing to entertain taking back a fair bit of that salary. But I do think a trade, at least in the short term, remains unlikely. But as we've seen around the NHL lately, you can never say never. And some of these contracts, as difficult as they might look, are not necessarily impossible to trade. So let me know down in the comments, do you think there's any chance the Wild could find a deal for Zach Parise and move on from this long-term contract? According to New York Post writer Larry Brooks, it looks as though the New York Rangers might be heading in the direction of buying out defenseman Kevin Shattenkirk. Now, as we've talked about in the last few days, with the contracts that the Rangers have signed signed recently, they're now over the salary cap limit. So they still have a couple contracts left to go, including forward Brendan Lemieux and defenseman Tony DeAngelo. So that's going to put them even further over the limit once those contracts are signed. Now, Larry Brooks believes that they'll actually accept their qualifying offers, which are $874,000 apiece. I'm not entirely convinced that they would both do that. Maybe Lemieux, but I think DeAngelo likely would prefer a bigger contract. I do think he's earned it given the season he just had. But irregardless, they're going to need at least a couple $1 million to take care of those two players, plus they're already over. Now, we discussed the possibility of them making some trades to move some salary out, but he believes that's not as likely going to happen. Mainly because the Rangers would be dealing from a position of weakness. Teams would know that they're shedding salary to become cap compliant, and they're certainly not going to be giving them the type of offers that they would really prefer, especially on a guy like Chris Kreider. And Kreider obviously is still a pretty decent player, can still be very productive, has 1 year left on his contract, and for the most part would be probably a rental for most teams, but it could be a rental for a full year if it's done now rather than done at the deadline. But still, considering, like I said, we've seen other teams make moves, though, when they're in this kind of predicament, and the returns generally are not great. So he does have some valid points there. He feels later this week, when they have another opportunity to do a buyout, that Kevin Shattenkirk's days with the New York Rangers will come to an end. Now, that will free up a lot of space for the coming season, over $5 million, but a lot of that savings goes away in year two. They would still save some, but not nearly as much. A lot of the cap hit from year one would go back on in year two. They'd only save about $500,000. And of course, they still have 2 more years that would be added on addition to that. So obviously, they'd be stuck with the Shattenkirk contract in some capacity for 4 years instead of 2. But at the same time, they need to worry about this year first and foremost. And obviously, Shattenkirk has not worked out with the Rangers, so buying him out does make sense strictly from that perspective. But like I said, it could turn out to be quite expensive. Another buyout option as well is defenseman Brendan Smith. It's not quite clear if they'll go down the route of maybe buying both out or just Shattenkirk, or what exactly their plans are. But Larry Brooks does believe that Shattenkirk's days will be coming to an end, and we likely will still see them make a trade of a player potentially like Kreider, maybe Domestikov, or some other guys who could fall into the trade bait category. But that would come later. Once they're cap compliant, they could trade from a position of strength and likely get a much better return. So maybe closer to training camp or around then, but not in the short term, according to Larry Brooks' thoughts in this article. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Does it make more sense for the Rangers to buy out Shattenkirk, maybe even Smith as well, create the cap space that way to be compliant, and then consider making trades later so that they get a better return on the trade? But obviously these buyouts could be expensive. So let me know what you think down in the comments, and we'll continue discussing. Now, we come across another article discussing the possibility of the Sabres trading right-shot defenseman Rasmus Ristolainen. This one's from the Buffalo News and Lance Lazowski. Now, he does discuss the possibility that they may not trade him as well, given the fact that they have some injuries on the blue line like Zach Bogosian, who will likely miss the beginning of the season and be out for some time. So they very well could be starting the season shorthanded. If they trade away a guy like Ristolainen, they certainly could be losing a lot of experience on the blue line, but at the same time, they have made enough other acquisitions that they probably could be okay. Of course, this article references the possibility of trading him as well. 2 main trade partners that he suggests makes the most sense for the Sabres would include the Winnipeg Jets and the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, as we discussed before, I felt that the Sabres should target a number 2 center iceman so they can push guys like Casey Middlestat down the lineup, and even Dylan Cousins when he's ready to join the NHL as well, so they don't have so much pressure and can actually play a smaller role while they build up their abilities and their confidence levels to really be more dominant at the NHL level. Now, I know some of you have pointed out as well that Sam Reinhart can also play center and could be that number 2 center guy, but he can also play the wing and be effective in other positions as well. So personally, I think they should just target a top 6 forward. If they can get a center, great, but a top 6 winger certainly would suffice as well. This article recommends talking to the Jets about the possibility of acquiring Nick Ehlers. Obviously, Ehlers has a long-term contract at a pretty decent value. He's been a pretty regular goal scorer during the regular season, but it's had his struggles in the playoffs. But that's certainly something he can overcome. He's still quite young, and the Jets are a team that's going through a lot of transition. Obviously, they're up against the cap and have their own issues as well, and likely do need to shed a little bit more salary to get guys like Kyle Connor and Patrick Laine under contract for hopefully longer term deals. But either way, for the short term, regardless, they need the space and they need to make some decisions here in the short term. Now, he also recommends the possibility of talking to the Tampa Bay Lightning, and maybe they could acquire a package of assets, including center iceman Anthony Cirelli. Now, The one thing with the Lightning that we discussed before is a lot of their more experienced forwards that are locked up longer term with some decent contracts all have no trade clauses. There's not many that don't. So trading any of them would be kind of difficult. The one area that I find the Lightning have kind of handcuffed themselves to. So they would be more restricted to using some younger players that don't have that clause yet, like a Cirelli if they decided to go down that road. The Lightning have been rumored to wanting to add a right-shot defenseman for some time. Even before Erik Karlsson was traded to San Jose, they were rumored to be a big-time player in that. Obviously never landed them, and they've had some other rumors going around with some other guys as well. And they really haven't bolstered that blue line in a little while. They've obviously had some turnover on the blue line this offseason. And a guy like Ristolainen would make sense for them and something that they appear to be interested in. So especially if you're a Sabres fan, would you recommend they talk to Winnipeg or Tampa? Do you like either of those trade proposals? Do you think a guy like Nick Ehlers would fit well with the Sabres? Or should they maybe go for a package of players that might include a young center iceman like Anthony Cirelli, who very well could really give them that center depth that they're looking for as well. So that is all the latest NHL trade rumors here for today. So of course, as always, I want to hear your thoughts and opinions and everything we discussed here. Let me know what you think of some of these potential trades and what we might see for the remainder of this NHL offseason. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.